My parents, and my father in particular, have said for the longest time that they are sad because they feel like they have nothing to leave us. They don't have money. And it doesn't matter how many times I say, you don't owe us anything. You've given me life. I don't speak for my brothers, but, I'm here in part because you took me in. But then I said, actually, but your story is the legacy. I had no idea I was going to do it. And I built everything I do around their story of being on this land. I have engaged thousands of people around this story. And I just hope they live long enough to see it on TV, to understand it. Said, your story, that's what you left. It's not about money. It's not about land ownership. It is about you were here, you love that place. And it was evident every single day in every picture I have ever shown. And now they know it too.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map Education Center here at the Boston Public Library. And on behalf of both the Leventhal Center and the Boston Public Library, I want to welcome you to this afternoon's event. Before we begin the program, however, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through history and geography, including many difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to the Massachusetts people, and the metropolitan region is the home to many others, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag tribes and the Nipmuc nations. Copley Square, where those of you who are joining us in person today are standing or sitting right now, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in all of North America. The maps that are in the Boston Public Library's collections, they bear witness not only to these histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. And in some cases, the maps and objects in our collections don't simply document these stories, they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. So throughout all of our public programming, interpretation, exhibitions, education, and events, we encourage visitors, students, and learners from all walks of life to consider and sit with how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. I want to thank the Boston Public Library and the Boston Public Library Fund for supporting all of our work, and in particular, the Institute for Museum and Library Services for supporting our environmental justice programming this year at the Leventhal Center. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Leonard, the president of the Boston Public Library, who'll be introducing our guest and leading the conversation this afternoon. Again, thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Garrett, and welcome to all of you, both in person and online. I want to extend my thanks also to the Leventhal Map and Education Center staff, as well as the BPL AV and Programs team. And we are also assisted in production today by the GBH Forum Network and by Hosman Books. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome Dr. Carolyn Finney. She's a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer.
That's what I say.
That's right? What we say. So, and we will hear a little bit more about what that means in a few minutes. But her academic work spans a wide range of topics. She's a renowned world traveler. She has worked on gender and environmental issues. And of course, we're going to start our conversation after we get to know our guest with her 2014 work, Black Faces, White Spaces, and the subtitle, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. Dr. Carolyn Finney, welcome to your library. So good to have you here.
Welcome to my library. It's all mine.
Would you take a few minutes to just help us to get to know you a little bit so we can frame the work and your interest in it?
Yes, thank you. You can see I'm just, this is how I am. Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. And thank you, Garrett, as well, for helping to create a space for me to come in. I live in Burlington, Vermont, the traditional home of the Abenaki people. I drove in yesterday, and it's been about a year and a half since I've been in Boston, so it's really nice to be here. It's nice to be back. So yes, I can take a minute. I'm going to take a couple of minutes because that's how I am, but really to talk about why I do what I do. And so I spend a lot of time, I would say probably, the last 2.5, 3 years, I've probably engaged with people more than 200, 250 times. This is what I do, but I've been doing it for years, trying to build a public platform around this. But I need to back up a little bit, so I can say to you, you can look at my resume and I can say that I stand at the intersection of the arts, lived experience, and education. Before I went back to school, I was an actor for 11 years in New York and in LA. So my heart actually lives in the arts. It's kind of where I come from and where I see myself. And then I spent the better part of 5 years backpacking around the world. And then I decided I would go back to school to finish my undergrad in my mid-30s. And then for some reason, I kept going and I got my master's. And then for some reason, I kept going again. And then I got a doctorate. And so I sort of find myself in this position. But I want to go back to even earlier than that. One of the exercises that when I do work with students that I ask them to do is to consider your own environmental autobiography, right? So we all have one. We have a point of view about nature. We have a history about nature. We have memories about that. And if you can do that non-judgmentally, but understand that you come from a point of view, because I believe we're all biased. And bias is not the same as racism. Bias, again, is a point of view. And I think it's important to be able to claim that point of view to know where it is that you stand, right? And I'm biased when I come to this conversation. Yes, I've gone to school and I've read a lot of things and I've learned how to do research and think about things. And I still have a point of view about that. So it's really important for me to share with you where I grew up because that's where it all began. So, yeah, that's me. I have to go back a little farther than myself. I'm there with my father in one of his zinnia gardens. This is a grainy picture of my parents, Rose and Henry. Rose and Henry grew up in Floyd, Virginia. Black, poor, really large families, high school education. They grew up there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So they grew up there during Jim Crow segregation. My dad went off to fight in the Korean War. And when he came back from the war, he was looking for a job. And he told me a story of how he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. And he thought that looked like a great government job. And he went to apply as a veteran. And they told him, I'm sorry, but we don't hire Negroes. And after that, my parents, like a lot of Black people who lived in the South, decided to join the Great Migration and came north to New York. And they came to New York because my father had a sister who was a nurse, had come up to New York, was doing quite well for herself, got a job, got married. And when my parents got to New York, my father had 2 job offers. The first was in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. He could be a janitor. He didn't take that job. Instead, he was offered a job 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. A very wealthy Jewish family owned a 12-acre estate, and they needed full-time caretakers for that estate. And my father took that job. He was the chauffeur, the landscape gardener. My mom was a sometime housekeeper. There are 2 houses on this property. This one that you're seeing, which is the gardener's cottage, and this one, which is what I like to call the big house, which was close by. It's all on 12 acres that the owners would come up to mostly on weekends and holidays. This is a stunning piece of property, right? There's a swimming pool, there's a lake, there were flower gardens, there were peach, pear, plum trees, vegetable gardens. And my parents were hoping you can get we call this the lake. It was a pond, but we were kids, so it was small. So my parents moved to this all-white, very wealthy neighborhood. And I like to tell people that it was very wealthy. Harry Winston had property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived next door. So you just have an idea of the kind of wealth that was in the area. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 1990s, when a Japanese American woman moved in for a little while, and then she moved out. So my parents wanted to have kids, and it's important for me to say that they didn't think they could have kids, in part because my mother, like a lot of women who grew up poor, So this doesn't really necessarily have to do with color of skin, but I think for women in the 40s and 50s who grew up poor, she'd gone into the hospital to have an ovary removed from one of her, have a cyst removed from one of her ovaries, excuse me. And when she woke up, what they had done is removed one of her ovaries. And what they said to her was, we didn't ask you because we didn't think you could emotionally handle the information. So she thought that meant she couldn't have kids. And actually, I benefited because I was adopted. So with the help of the owners, they made the suggestion. My mother got incredibly depressed. They made the suggestion and they actually arranged for my adoption. I was born in Manhattan from the Spence Chapin Adoption Agency, which is in New York City. And then what I like to say to people is they relaxed and had my first brother. And then they did some more relaxing and they had my second brother. So me and my brothers had run of this place during the week when the owners weren't there. This is where we all knew how to swim by the time we were 7. This is where we rode bikes. This is where I played out in the woods. I mean, you're looking, these pictures have not been retouched. This is what this property looked like. It was really amazing. And the story that I also like to tell for people is when I really started to get a sense of myself in my brown skin on this property. It was, I think I always had some version of that because my father still is an angry Black man. He's angry. He was angry all the time. He really liked his job, but he was very mistrustful of the United States. He was very mistrustful of the government. And he was always infusing. He was a more Malcolm X than Martin Luther King. And people will understand that in terms of what he was always espousing these ideas in the household, which drove me crazy. I'm just going to be honest, as a kid, he was angry all the time. I want to say that I was 9 years old. Me and my brothers went to Mamaroneck Avenue Public School, largely Italian-American working class, handful of African-American working class. And the way that neighborhood was divided is like a lot of neighborhoods in the United States in terms of beautiful outdoor spaces. We lived up on the hill. So all the big houses with the big yards and the woods were up on the hill, and you could take your bike down the hill in just a few minutes, and suddenly you were in what was called the flats, which is more buildings and stores in the sense of the working class. And so I was walking home one day from school and at 9, and I was right around the corner from the house, and there were always policemen patrolling that area, right, because of all the wealth. And this white policeman in his car stopped me. He asked me where I was going. I gave him the address, and he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" I'm like, "Dude, I'm 9, which I didn't say, but I said no, but I was confused and said, "No, I live there." And he let me go, and I went home and I told my parents, and my father got really angry. He called the police station, he gave them hell, and they never bothered me or my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to think about the logics. What were the logics? I was a little 9-year-old girl with my school bag, time of day. He didn't stop to ask me, did I know where I was going? Did I need help? Was I okay? Where was I going and did I work there, right? So I want to jump ahead now to the 90s. So this gate wasn't on the driveway when I was living there. So now my parents have been caring for this land full-time for over 40 years. The patriarch of the family that owned the land had died many years earlier, but the matriarch was still alive, and she got very sick. So she knew that she was going to pass away, and she was concerned about what would happen to my parents when she died. And to her credit, she considered trying to keep them on this land, wanting to give them that gardener's cottage. The land at the time was worth over $3 million. The property taxes were over $125,000 a year. My dad had been making like $25,000 a year. So unless she was willing to pay those property taxes in perpetuity, which I do believe she was considering, but her children were not, that wasn't going to happen. So instead, they had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, or as my dad likes to call it, Sleesburg. And that's no offense on Leesburg. That's just my dad. He was born in Virginia, and he has always been angry with the state. So she had a lovely house built for them on a ½ acre of property. When she passed away, she asked for my father to be at her bedside. And it's really important for me, actually, but for everyone to understand that power is complicated. And power does not mean that there isn't love in the room, but it is complicated, right? When she passed away, the new owner came on, asked my parents to stay on, which they did until 2003. So now they've been caring for this land for nearly 50 years, full time. and they're in their 70s at this point. So they leave, the house is finished, they move to, my brothers and I had long since grown up and left and were moving around. They picked Leesburg, Virginia, because my youngest brother had gotten married, had kids and had settled down. Since I'm never doing that, whatever, my other brother, right? So that's where they chose to go. I watched my father in particular get really depressed, and he talked about missing the land. So this is right when I'm working on my doctorate. I had been focused on Nepal and conservation, but I started thinking about issues having to do with race, African Americans in particular, right here at home, and issues of land and belonging and who gets to claim it as their place and that they're part of that place. They received a copy of a letter. This was maybe 5 or 6 years after they had moved, from the Westchester Land Trust. And it sent a copy of a letter to all the old neighbors. One of the neighbors had forwarded the letter to my parents. It's a 2-page letter letting everybody in the old neighborhood know that a conservation easement had now been placed on this piece of property. A conservation easement, as I learned at the time, meant that, as I understood it, was that in perpetuity, the land would be protected. And I got a copy of the letter. It talked about all the environmental values of this piece of land, the wildlife, where it sits in the watershed. And I agree with everything about it. They said it should be protected. At the end of the letter, the Westchester Land Trust thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. He'd been on the land for, what did I say, 5, 6 years? There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years. And just like that, they were gone from the environmental history. And that's actually what riled me up, not just about my parents, but all the people in the history of this country who are invisible, who've been diminished, who've been erased, who are not there, and how that then informs these environmental narratives where we want to outreach and help and do things for people we think don't already know something about the place that they've been living on, and in many cases for generations, that they are attached, that they belong, that they love it, that they know some things about it, and that have their own tables. They don't always have to come to yours. They actually have their own, right? Where they may be doing some things and learning about some things because they've had a long time doing it. So yeah, I feel a way about that. I'm very hopeful and all those things. And I feel a way about that. I know one more thing.
Okay.
I know you got some questions, but see, you open the door to me. This is what happens. And just because I like to put this up there because it makes me feel like I'm cool. But so I told you that I spent the better part of 5 years backpacking around the world in Nepal. I lived there for quite a while. And that for me is one of the most, when you pick a moment in your life, something that has really influenced you and sort of changed who you are, it was the experience and having the privilege of doing that over 5 years, which really did change me. I was obsessed with travel adventure books. It was all I would read. I was living in New York. I go to every independent bookstore. I find every story about every person that ever sailed a boat around the world, walked through a jungle, crossed a desert, climbed a mountain, didn't matter. Mountain climbing, I could tell you about everybody. I would always surprise people with what I knew. They'd be like, how do you? Because you look like that and you know that. And I'd be like, yes, because I'm just all up in it about why people do these things. The thing is, I couldn't find a single story about anybody who looked like me doing it. And I knew I wasn't the only one who looked like me doing it, right? And that just niggled in the back of my head for the longest time. I want to jump all the way to last fall when the New York Times asked me to write a piece. They were doing a series over the year called Black History Continued, and they never fully focused on the environment before. And so over the course of the year, somebody wrote about Black foragers, Black surfers, the incredible Betty Reed Soskin, the oldest park ranger in the service, who just turned 101, and she looks amazing. Anyway, they interviewed her because it was her 100th birthday. And they asked me to write a final piece about, is there some kind of Black environmental frontier imaginary in terms of, who's been out there historically as Black people on the land doing their adventure thing. And they also said, can you put a little bit of it in there about yourself? And I did. And I named all these people, that I could fit into a small article about who've been doing things, who are out there. And finally, one of the editors, who happened to be white, said to me, so can you talk about how these stories inspired you to do everything that you did? I said, actually, you've got it backwards. The thing for me, the inspiration was the fact I knew the stories were there, but I wasn't seeing them anywhere. So part of my motivation is, how do we have and tell different kinds of stories? There's one more thing I'm going to say, and then I'll stop, I promise. because it's important to come back to the story and what has happened in the last 2 years. So there they are, last day, 2003, on the property. The tree behind them is a weeping cherry tree. And on my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, my father, in a very unusual moment, gave my mother something romantic, which was a mini weeping cherry tree instead of a bottle of perfume, but that's its own story. And when they left, they couldn't take the tree with them, right? Because there it is, right? Roots in the ground. Because of everything that happened in 2020, the murder of George Floyd, Christian Cooper getting his skin weaponized against him, I do this work all the time, and suddenly that really exploded. I wrote a piece in The Guardian, and I just started to have this conversation more with people, but also institutions and organizations. Let me rephrase that. Predominantly white institutions and organizations were reaching out, wanting to have this conversation, provide support. And one of those organizations was the New York Botanical Gardens, who said that we'd love to have you come down here and do so, whatever it is you're working on. And for some reason over Zoom, I started telling them this story about the cherry tree. And they said, we're the New York Botanical Gardens. I want to know. They said, I bet you we could get access to the property, get a grafting of the tree, bring it back to the New York Botanical Gardens and tell the story of your parents. And I was moved and blown away. I said, oh my God, that would be amazing. In 2019, I had spoken at the Mountain Film Festival in Telluride, because their theme that year, they do environmental films, and they have this every May. And the focus that year had been equity, and they'd asked me and a bunch of other people to come out and speak. And so in front of a very well-heeled audience, and it's very well-heeled in Telluride, I told 20 minutes this story and asked the question, whose story counts? There were a lot of film directors in the audience. One in particular, who I didn't meet on that day, is a white film director named Irene Taylor, who's won Emmys for her work, who reached out to me on Zoom and said, listen, HBO has asked me to do a documentary about trees, and I want to talk about real people in relationship to a specific species of tree. I'm going to talk about the Weyerhaeuser family and all the money they've made off timber. But I realized when thinking about what you said there, I didn't have a single story about a Black person in here. Could you help me think about what that would be? And, because I'm, like to play little tricks, and I do it with a smile, I said, well, if you're going to talk about African Americans and trees, lynching may be the way to go. Yeah, that's what she did, pretty much what you all just did. And then I smiled, and she said, you're right, but I'm not the person to do that. And then I said, yeah, and we're not just the bad things that happen to us. And I told her the story about the cherry tree just to get her to think differently about it. She liked the story so much. One of those stories is going to be about my family. And so it blossomed into this opportunity for me to return to the land after 18 years in the summer of 2001. I hadn't been on it either in 2001. But before that, the folks at the conservation place asked the conservation organization, said, can you send us a picture so we know where this cherry tree is? So you can see it there right next to the pink hydrangea. And I sent them this picture, and I was like, I couldn't understand why they didn't know, because I thought everything was protected because it was under a conservation easement. And that's when I discovered that actually everything is not protected under a conservation easement. After 2 weeks, this is the picture they sent back. It had all been landscaped. The tree was gone. So for about 3 or 4 days, everything was dead in the water. The film project, the New York Botanical Gardens, there was grafting, and there was no tree to graft. And I sunk into a really bad depression, and then I got really angry. Because I said, this is what always happens, erasure. This is what happens all the time, all the time. And I called the director, I said, actually, this is a story you need to tell, because this is what happens all the time. But then after another day or two passed, and I started feeling my hopeful self, I said, well, what if we could get everybody on board to plant a new weeping cherry tree? We can get the Westchester Land Trust, the New York Botanical Gardens, the new owners, because now there are these 2 new owners. They're a couple who are medical doctors who live on the land, who knew nothing about the history of it, and get everybody involved to do it. And the short is that we did, and we got everybody involved. And we planted a new tree. And I know it looks like I did all the work, and I didn't. There's an actual forester who did most of the digging. But I was able to return to the land, and HBO was there as well. The film crew and the new owners were there, and everybody was there. The last thing I will say, and then I will stop talking. David's like, "Oh my God, yeah, this is how I wrote
this is your hour."
The last thing I will say is that, because I do this, I said this earlier, I love doing what I do. I feel really privileged that I get to do what I do and pay my rent doing what it is I do. And I get depressed a lot. It exhausts me a lot. There's a lot of emotional labor involved because it's personal as well as professional, as well as political. It's all those things. It's intimate. It means something to me. And I really want to be accountable for what it is that I put out there, right, at every juncture. So this was back in April. I was at Brown University in my hotel room, getting ready to go do my thing. And I was just feeling down. And I opened my email, and this is what was in my email. So the Westchester Land Trust promised that at least once or twice a year, they go back and take a picture of the new tree so that I could see it. And what moved me was not simply seeing the new tree, but the owners had taken it upon themselves to plant daffodils around the tree. And what they could not know is that daffodils are my father's favorite flower. And in that moment, I was just really moved to think about everything, that potential and the possibility, and how a story can change because you decide that you're going to change it and find another way forward. And for me, I'm really clear that I don't want to cancel anybody out in order to make space for my story or anybody else's. And so I'm always asking the question, so how do we do that? How do we do that differently? And now I promise to stop talking.
Thank you for being so open and honest. That is quite the personal analysis of how these issues show up. Your work is also has a more academic bent, or the work that the research that it's based on, and this will come back together, right? Because it's one giant narrative.
Yes, it's one giant narrative. Yes.
But the base hypothesis of the work is that Black people, African Americans, people of color in particular, are just not visible in some of the major outdoor spaces. Please take that, run with it. Tell me what's wrong with that way of phrasing it. And then how do you validate? How did you validate beyond your own personal experience that was a fact?
So part of the reason, thank you for the question, and part of the reason that I tell you all of that is because this was all happening while I was back in school. It's the only African-American in the program at the time, actually not far, Clark University in Worcester, as they say here. And I say those things not to make people uncomfortable, but just like it was one of the facts of what it meant to be myself, looking like myself in the room, taking classes on conservation and environment. I didn't think about myself as an environmentalist. I was really trying to understand as a geographer the relationship between people and place, the human environment relationship. What does that look like? Why do we do what we do, where we do it, where the power relationships are? What does it mean to be able to claim a piece of land as your own? What does it mean to be able to say you belong? What is the role of identity, how we show up as ourselves and how other people see us, which we know is often not the same thing, right? And how we get categorized. So when I was thinking about this, partly because my advisor said, you should write about this because nobody's writing about this like that. The reason that it's academic, I started off as a dissertation because it had to be, but it was never what I wanted to do. I had a job as a professor at UC Berkeley at the time. And as part of the tenure process and the process of moving, I knew I had to write a more academic book. And for some people, that wasn't academic enough. So I wanted to walk a line because for me, you see me leaning forward, is if my parents with their 12th grade education can't understand what it is I'm doing, then who am I doing this for? Because most of the world does not have a college degree. And a college degree doesn't mean you know more than somebody else. You just know something differently than someone else. So I need to be able to communicate in a way that is not about talking down to anyone, but being able to meet somebody across their differences in order to understand. So I was trying to combine both that academic rigor, but also the rigor of what does it mean to be able to talk about something, show something, explain something, and invite people to consider something that often people want to avoid because, look like me, walk into a predominantly white room and say the word race and see what happens. Right. So, and I do it with humor because I said, what I want to open up is the invitation to consider. You don't have to agree with me. I'm actually not really interested in whether you agree with me. I'm interested in how we can stand in good relationship with each other across those differences. I even forgot what you asked me. What am I supposed to be answering?
So
I was taking off there.
I was both thinking about the juxtaposition between personal experience and the research work.
Yes.
But also the base hypothesis.
Yes. So part of the juxtaposition is actually, if I'm going to talk in academic terms, is a feminist take on it. So this was the early 2000s. There's a lot more academic work written on the importance of using the I. It's so interesting to me over the years, the hundreds of academic works that are out there where people can talk about it objectively. And I'm going to just say it without ever saying that I said this. I chose this information. I decided to put this information in this form. I'm theorizing about it in this way, is owning that, because that's actually saying, yes, there is some bias, there's subjectivity embedded in there. And how much the pushback every time I use the I, how some people push back. Why do you keep putting yourself in there, right? Number one. Number two, I want to say that, so Fran Lebowitz, who's this really thoughtful thinker who happens to be Jewish, who goes around the country, talks to a lot of people, was talking about how she did not understand why people expect books to be doors. Books to be mirrors. She thinks that if you read a book, it should be a door, but why does it have to be a mirror to reflect? And she had this conversation with the Black writer, Toni Morrison. And she said to Toni Morrison, she said the same thing. She goes, Toni, you're not your readers. And Toni just laughed at her and said, oh, yes, I am. Right. And something that Fran didn't understand was that she's never had to worry about it because she's always reflected in the majority of writing out there. But when you're not, it is really important in part for me to claim my place, be accountable for what I've said, be responsible to what I've said, but also own that I'm saying it too. Like, this has something to do with me. I'm not going to pretend for a minute that it doesn't have something to do with me. Also, one more thing. Poor David.
No, go ahead.
Is something I like to say recently. The incredible civil rights lawyer, Brian Stevenson, if you don't know who he is, this man has been to the Supreme Court 5 times, and he works to get Black men and Black teenagers off death row, and just an incredible human being. And about a year and a half ago, for some reason, I didn't know him, who he was, and I watched this documentary, and I was like, oh, we're like the same age, and I was just like, oh, we're born one day apart. I was like, I don't know, having some fantasy up in my head. Anyway, what moved me was when the interviewer asked him why he does what he does, because he works all the time. He doesn't have a partner. He doesn't have kids. And I'm checking off the list. Oh, that's me. That's me. That's me. That's me. Mm-hmm. And the first thing he says is, well, I do what I do because the system is broken. And I'm like, yes. And then he paused a little bit. And he said, well, I do what I do because people are broken. And I went, oh, yeah, me too, you know. And then his voice got kind of small. And he said, I do what I do because I'm broken too. And that laid me out, because I said, and that's true too. So part of my approach to writing the book, you know, connecting the personal to the historical, to these larger narratives that are happening out in the world, is in part to be true to that. You know, I'm not looking at it objectively. I'm not acting like there isn't a legacy of that past in my own life or in my family's life. There is actually. In all of our lives, there is. The trauma doesn't look the same. I like to say everybody's traumatized. Everybody in this room. Everybody isn't traumatized in the same way. Doesn't understand that in the same way, but everybody is traumatized. How can we not be? We live in this country in a relationship to each other with all of these issues that we're all contending with on a daily basis in different ways, right? So I'm always looking for how can we have that conversation so it opens up the widest possible opportunity for different kinds of people to enter into the conversation.
Might it be that trauma is the space that we actually have the most common ground in?
Oh, look at you throwing down some knowledge.
You may have to ask me a question back as a result of that.
Yeah. It might be, and where I'm still figuring that out, why I'm tentative is that with respect to people, different kinds of trauma, by just bringing up trauma, traumatizes. So I would frame it differently because I'm not trained in dealing with trauma. So I might use a more generic term and think of pain, sure. How we are vulnerable, looking for commonality, you know, thinking about what we have in common. We all bleed and we're all going to die. And oh my God, we can only go up for here in the conversation. And but there's something about that, to understand like that it gives us some place to stand. We don't have to have anything else in common, but to understand that we need to breathe, we need water, we need to put food in our bodies, we need sunlight. But I also believe we need joy. I believe we need people. We need each other in different ways, right, in order to make it through. So I think you're correct. And I probably wouldn't choose to start there because I think it would
That wasn't one of my
scare
written
people
down
off.
questions. It was just
That's even
reflecting
better.
back to what you were just talking about. But it strikes me, and I've done a lot of reading, particularly since 2020, George Floyd and the other names that we learned through tragedy during that period. Although some of us have 400 years to catch up on these matters. That in reality, when we think of either explicit racism or systemic racism, we're thinking of banking, we're thinking of urban planning. The outdoors is not what comes to mind first. And it strikes me that it sounds like one of your professors said to you, no one else is writing about this, you should write about this. So could you tell us a little bit about the importance of also looking at human relationship to the outdoor spaces through the lens of systemic racism as well?
I can. So there was a couple of different things that popped in my head when you said that. I was thinking, well, first of all, we hear about wildlife. So take wolves, for instance, right? And if, wolves are in Yellowstone where they are protected. But, animals and wolves don't read the sign. They don't get to the park gate and go, it says the park ends here, so we shouldn't go out, because we know wild animals do that all the time. I think racism pretty much operates the same way, because wherever we go, there we are, right? And we are in all those spaces. I want to say that, what I find so fascinating about the idea of the national parks. So it's important that I say I served on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. And I had I never really paid much attention to the national parks before that. And I learned a lot about the national parks. Part of why I use it in the book to write about it was not because people would say, oh, so your work is on national parks. I said, no, I use the national parks because the national parks were created. It was about creating a sense of American identity for the rest of the world to see, because unlike Europe, we don't have the really old cathedrals and old buildings, but what we had was great natural landscapes. And the idea of Roosevelt and Muir were others about, well, not only can we protect it, but how can we reflect out to others? This is who we are. We are the Grand Canyon, the Everglades, Yellowstone, Yosemite. This is who we are. And so then I started to get into ideas of American identity. I said, oh, that's really interesting, right? Because we still don't agree about that. What does it mean to be American, and who gets to claim it, right? So that conversation about identity for me is floating around, particularly in a country that, number one, stole all the land from indigenous people, killed a lot of them in order to get it. I'm just going to be blunt. 2, enslaved another group of people to work that land for free, right? And then when that group of people were originally given 400,000 acres of land, white plantation owners said, oh my God, we just gave people who are property 4,000 acres of land, and land is never just about land, it's about economic and political power, and it is about legacy, and it's about the right to say you belong, and they took all that land back. At the same time, we create the Homestead Act. So this is where people mostly of European descent, but not only, get to go out on a piece of land, and if they can stake up to 160 acres, if they live on it for 5 years, if they build a house and if they farm, that land is then theirs free and clear. So I don't have to tell you another thing to start to look at the messiness all that caused, right? Private property versus public. Oh yeah, the idea that somehow we're separate from nature. Whose idea was that we're not part of it? So we frame everything. So these large framings, we've set it up in a very particular way, which makes it easier for some to say, you don't belong here. My people have been here since 1600 because they came over on this boat, that boat, or the other. They worked hard. Many of them died. And all of that is true. And what about the people that were on it for hundreds of years earlier? So what does that mean if you were brought over as a slave because you didn't come over on your own free will? And you labored on the land, but it was never yours. How do we even reconcile that conversation? And I didn't mention South Asians. I didn't mention people who came up from Central and South America. I mean, I didn't mention Chinese building the railroad. We could keep going and going and going, all that history that we had to uncover. So part of what I was trying to do was just start to point to those pieces of conversation, always stating that I have a stake in that. Yeah. Because we all have a stake in it, which is why there are those pushing back on what they are calling revisionist history, as opposed to considering a broader history of who we've been. Because we could go around this room and you will all have a really interesting story to tell about your family and how they got here and why you were here, and all those stories would be different. And then we'd have to start to think about those stories in relationship to each other. Right.
Inclusionary history, if not revisionary history.
Yes, inclusionary. So here's my thing with inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes, and inclusion assumes for me that what we're being included in is unproblematic. Mm-hmm. And actually, I would challenge that idea. That maybe it's not about being included into something. I used to say, it's not about, this idea of center to the margins, those on the margins wanting to be brought into the center. And I'm saying, what? The center is kind of messed up. And some of the most exciting new work, emergent work, is happening on the margins. Maybe there's a different model. So if we think like a web of relationships, so it becomes nodes, if you're looking at it, if we had a board and I had nodes and just lines going everywhere, crisscrossing and connecting, something that's not hierarchical, something that doesn't, it's funny how something can get at the center and it becomes rigid and calcified, and it becomes the thing that we're always operating around, as opposed to considering we might need to operate together doing something new and different. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Yeah, I think inclusion doesn't have to be a way of just not correcting the power imbalance that has occurred in that model. But we could talk for an hour on that as well.
We could talk. I can talk for an hour on anything.
We are going to take some audience questions in about 5 minutes or so. I do want to. Just one reaction to what you just said about what is the concept of land ownership, contrasting this homestead privilege that happens with your own parents being there for 50 years of this land and not being able to have any rights to it per se legally. That together, that narrative just makes complete sense to me. You root in the book much of the 20th century piece of what goes wrong in the Jim Crow laws as a partial explanation for why the outdoor spaces don't have a great relationship with African Americans.
Yes.
Yes, I got it, right?
Are you asking me?
I am.
I do? Oh, okay.
That's what I took away. So I'd like to get your reaction.
So I'm not a historian. I'm a geographer, right? And so the way that I engaged history, and it's important for me to say that because I know a lot of historians are really good at what they do, and there's a way to do that, right? I'm pointing to history because I believe there's a legacy of that. Like I'm influenced in very particular ways, we all are. And Jim Crow, the idea of it looms large for me. I mean, I was born in 1959, so it means I was born right at the tail end of that. But I lived with parents who they grew up in that for most of their lives, and trying to understand a country and a people who for how many years, 50, 60 years, decided that there were some people who just weren't worthy, who weren't fully human, who couldn't engage in spaces, including beaches, including nature walks, including parks, in the same way as everybody else. There's something phenomenal about that to me, that we could collectively as human beings make that choice for another group of people. It's not just one group of people, but I'm just saying. So there was something, it just loomed large in me, this idea of segregating people out based on something that nobody can help, which is the skin that you were born in, right? Nobody can help that, and how we have commodified that. And it influences every institution in this country, even today. The fact we still have conversations like Oscar's so white, and what about the publishing industry? Why don't we see more people of color? We say it in every single institution that we have, right? So clearly there's a legacy to that. And what do we have to get through in our own minds? What do we have to change in terms of the way we think about who gets to have their story elevated, have their experience understood? And actually, for me, it's not simply about extracting or transacting those stories, right? It is also about understanding, if I'm going to listen to your story and actually do something about that, I have to change. And that's what I think a lot of people resist, right? That I have to change. I work a lot with organizations a lot of predominantly white organizations that genuinely want to do something different around their environmental work and how they think about who it is that engage. And I said, for a long time, people wanted to do outreach, and I think people still do. And outreach meant that I could outreach to you, and I would say, bring you to my table and make a place for you at my table. And then what had to happen is you had to learn everything about the table. You go around, you got to learn all our names, the mission statement, the culture. We actually don't have to learn a thing about you. And nothing at the table changes except that we've made space. But I said, so what happens if you throw out the table? And everybody has to shift. And often that is the resistance. I heard, and I don't mean to be political with this, but years ago at Berkeley, President Clinton claimed to speak. And the thing that stayed with me that he said, it was 2008, 2009. He said, for developing countries, the challenge is infrastructure. They need to focus on that. But for countries like the United States, our biggest challenge is the rigidity of our institutions. And I wrote that sucker down. Because I said, oh my gosh, I think we conflate this idea that in order to remember who we are and be true to that, we have to keep things rigid, that the institution, it has to stay the way it is, instead of understanding that all we have to do is remember. But actually what we were doing 50 years ago when many of these institutions were created does not serve today. And I will make the case that in many cases, it didn't serve a lot of people then either, which doesn't mean we have to throw anybody out, but we definitely have to learn some new skills about how we differently show up now as who we are.
I will open up for questions after this next one. What is, based on that, what is your advice for the institutions to do better? The ones that are, institutions like the Boston Public Library, the ones like the National Park Service, fill in the blank.
Yes, so I'm always very careful because I have some general advice without, I like to actually engage with people and learn more about who you are before I assume what you might need. And there's general advice. I think about things like leadership. So I think we're very comfortable with what I like to call the charismatic mega leader, meaning that there's somebody at the top and then everybody else goes down underneath. The Park Service was built in part on a military structure, and that's often how the military operates. So what happens if we think about co-leadership? What happens if we just change the leadership dynamic? Even in some of the language that we use, not outreach, what does it mean to build relationship with a community? When people have a new idea, often, and I've done this too, we focus on the product. So what are we going to produce? It's going to cost this much money. We've got to produce it. We have this much time to do it. The visioning piece is really quick. We kind of move through that really fast and we get to the product instead of spending the bulk of our time on the vision process. Because actually, if you don't have your dream, if you don't come correct with your dream, how do you think you're going to come correct with your product? Number one. Number two, who is part of the visioning process? Who gets to determine who that is, actually? And all of those things take more time because it means building relationship with those you don't know. And yes, that takes time. You have to build trust, particularly with people and communities that have a long history of not trusting, and it is justified. They have proof, which means, yes, you're going to have to prove yourself, not simply because you have a lot of money in the bank, not simply because you have a lot of political will, but because you're willing to show up and be wrong. I did one talk on this conservation organization, and the head of that organization, this white man, finally, it was time for Q&A, and he was so lovely, and he just blurted out in front of all his staff and everybody, but what if I make a mistake? And I said, you know what, you will make a mistake, but not because you're white, but because you're human. And it's what you do after you make the mistake. And you're going to make a bunch of them. but how do you show up after you make the mistake? Because that's what people are paying attention to. I also want to say, just because you're on the other side, you're a member of a community, doesn't mean that you're not going to make a mistake either. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody comes to the table with an emotional overload of trauma and information. It's not always the same. It doesn't show up in the same way, but everybody comes to it with that. And how do we get better at making space and taking the time to discern, not judge, but discern what that is? What does it mean to be radically vulnerable? Which means that I'm going to choose to be really open to you and stand in that as my strength. And yes, it's a risk, but I'm willing to take a risk in order to gain, not take a risk simply because I'm afraid of losing something. And I feel like that's where we are. You see me like leaning, I'm on the edge of my seat now. I'm ready to stand up and say a thing.
We've come back to pain and shared mistakes,
Okay.
Interestingly enough.
I knew you were going to remind me of that. That's good. Okay.
Let's take a few questions from the audience. I do have a couple from registration. If we could bring the lights up a little bit, and because I can't see any hands at this point. We have one in front, and I think there's one up behind. So please wait for the microphone to come to you so that we can have our online audience here as well. And we'll also be able to take some online audience questions also. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello again.
Excellent talk. Thank you for the library for organizing this in this way. This is very organic, true to the topic. I want to go straight to the thing that made me cry first, which was the manifestation of the daisies, right?
The daffodils.
Daffodils,
Yeah.
yes, daffodils.
Yeah.
And what it meant to you in the terms of the significance of the process, because you talked about losing the tree, depression, then being open to the possibilities, creating a movement of people planting trees, and then, for me, what looked like your father's love and blessing sprinkled throughout. So I just want to get your take on what that meant for you in terms of this process and how it relates to all the processes that you're now talking about in terms of healing.
Yeah. Thank you, Latifa, for that. I'm still processing this, right? Things are still, the documentary comes out in 2003. I write a lot about this. It was weird I realized I had to own that it's a lot easier for me to talk about my parents not being on the land, having to leave the land, than it is for me to talk about I had to leave the land. And I understand that it's a way for me to avoid talking about what it meant for me to return. And it was weird to return with 9 other people, the president of the Western Land Trust and the film crew. And I was sort of above myself the whole day there because I tend to be really emotional, but I felt like I couldn't be. I was just feeling mixed feelings about it. My dad has Alzheimer's. So both my parents are still alive. They're 90, 91. And so a lot of things he can't remember. I showed them a lot of this, and I've told them this story. They don't understand what it is I do. I've been trying to figure it out for years, but they do recognize this. And one of the things that what I didn't say to you, when we got everybody on board, the film crew, the land trust, New York Botanical Gardens, we weren't hearing from the new owners. And I had said to the land trust and New York Botanical Gardens, why don't you reach out to them? And after it wasn't working. And I said, well, if they're okay with giving me their email, I'd love to write them a personal letter. So I wrote them about a page and a half letter saying who I was and my family. I never used the word race once, though I said my parents are African-American and who I was and how I wanted to honor my parents. I knew they were near the end of their lives. And the woman wrote me back in 20 minutes and said, we'd like to be part of honoring in that process. So part of thinking about the tree for me is that it's not simply my story or my family's story. It's actually their story too. That's what I want. I want everybody to be accountable for the fuller story. The daffodils she didn't have to do that. So beyond that, how did she know? She didn't know my father. It's my father's favorite flower, that they chose to do that anyway. The old tree, they also planted them where the old tree was because there's a tree stump there. That they will care for this tree. And that becomes part of their story. When we came back on this land, the owner before this had removed all the flower beds, all the vegetable gardens. He cut down all the fruit trees. They were all gone. And so anything that needs daily tending was gone. The owners who bought the land had no idea that other stuff was there before. So it was also sharing with them about this legacy. And, we could go back, because I know indigenous people were on this land. So I just want to say we could keep going back. And I just wasn't going back and back. Even the film director went back to the 1800s to try to go back to see how far back we could go and see on this land. So there's something for me about, and finally, I want to say an answer to that, sorry, is that my parents and my father in particular have said for the longest time that they are sad because they feel like they have nothing to leave us. They don't have money. And it doesn't matter how many times they say, you don't owe us anything. You've given me life. I don't speak for my brothers, but, I'm here in part because you took me in. But then I said, actually, but your story is the legacy. I had no idea I was going to do it. And I built everything I do around their story of being on this land. I have engaged thousands of people around this story. And I just hope they live long enough to see it on TV, to understand it. Said, your story, that's what you left. It's not about money. It's not about land ownership. It is about you were here, you love that place. And it was evident every single day in every picture I have ever shown. And now they know it too.
Thank you. Take the next question, please. Would you like to comment on the connection between art and this public spaces and how important that truly is in our society? Because I think that core point is really, really important for us to hear.
And thank you for sharing that information. Yes, and as somebody, I think I said at the beginning, because I stand at that intersection of art, right, education, lived experience, and sort of come through that. It actually made me think of a project. So when I was serving on the National Parks Advisory Board, this is probably around 2012 or so, we met in Washington, D.C., and it was a nonprofit that worked primarily with African-American and Latinx teenagers doing different kinds of art projects, but they wanted to engage them with national parks and environmental issues. So they had projects where many of them had never spent outside overnight, like camping. And so they went to Rock Creek Park and they did different things like that, and then brought them back together and asked them to do some art project around it. So part of what they were doing, these young people were so talented. They were doing spoken word about climate change and talking about their experience. They painted a mural at the National Zoo. But what was really powerful as we were listening to it was the fact that, number one, they found a way to express how their own experience of having this experience in the outdoors on their own terms, but also that they understood the complexity. So for many of them, it was great. I've had this great experience. Now I came back to my neighborhood and I see all the garbage. And they were kind of then, so what do I do with that? So I love the way that art allowed them, as opposed to a usual Q&A or a more strictly academic way in, that they could express how they felt about a thing, as well as what they were thinking about this thing, and trying to understand and grapple with all the different issues that come up for them. And for me, it always raises the question, then, well, what do we do next after that? So Great. They can explore some more.
Thank you. I think one more question. Thank you. And maybe we'll take the final one from over here, and then we'll
Could I ask one from the Zoom room after this?
Yes, let's do that. That's good. Thanks, Garrett. Go ahead.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being
What's your
here
name?
For your talk. My name's Emma.
Emma.
I work for a nonprofit in Boston, Youth Enrichment Services, and our big thing is bringing primarily low-income folks of color from Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester to outdoor spaces that they've never been able to experience before. Yeah. I love what I do, and also I recognize that a lot of our board, our executive director, and our two other director-level folks are all white. What would you say? I know that a lot of what you write about and what you think about is the erasure of people of color in these spaces. We are trying to actively prevent that and bring people into spaces so that they are not only remembered, but also thought of as, yes, Black people, Asian people can be at a ski resort. But with that and our white leadership and our white volunteers, there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with bringing very vulnerable kids of color to spaces that are, there's more history and more trauma in those spaces than they know what to do with. So I'm just wondering what sorts of things do you say, or would you think to say to organizations like this who are coming to you for help and for advice? How do you do that in a way that actually is truthful?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I think about, if I have time, if the organization has time, so I meet with them more than even a one-off, I would say that, how do you take inventory of your own organization in terms of your capacity to engage across difference? Often I find that, and most of the folks I've worked with are really well-meaning, are thoughtful, and really want to do something. And I understand why most of them don't know what to do. Because if you've, and I say this very gently, if you've lived in a world, I say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. So if you lived in a world where you're an empathetic and kind person, and you haven't had to contend with that because it's just not part of your life, and now you're suddenly being asked to contend with it, of course you don't know what to do. Sometimes I say to other people that the expectation that a white organization or institution is going to suddenly step up, they don't know what they're doing, and they need a different skill set actually to figure that out. So the first thing for me is for them to take stock of that for themselves, to see where they're at. And I say, and how can you be supported to do that work? Because what I understand as a fellow human being, that it is hard to take a leap to a place you've never been. And you're being asked to consider some things that you didn't even know were true, but now you're being told that they are. And what does that mean for you? And how does that translate? And what kind of person have I been? And all those questions of guilt and shame and fear around doing the same thing. And perhaps you've been doing it all along, or perhaps you've never been doing it. You have to suddenly have space to ask those questions safely, honestly. So that's number one, and that could take a long time. And I understand that sometimes we have to be doing things simultaneously. How do you then build relationships with people that you can trust, that can help you, not provide the answers? It is not the job. And it's important for me to say this because we're talking about race, but for me, any group that considers themselves different, is not the job of that group to provide all the education for anybody. Right, number one. And it doesn't mean that that group then doesn't know something that they can share. And that comes for me through relationships. So what is it like to invite people to share in the spoils? And I mean it in the best way, over meals, getting together, community events. There's a fantastic organization right here in Boston I've been involved with for years called The Guild. It's in Dorchester. Jonna Sexy, it's such an incredible organization, trying to think differently. I serve on their board. And what's amazing is the way that Jonna isn't simply what they do, but how they do it. How do organizations practice a different kind of leadership structure? How do they practice a different way? And all of that's going to take longer. And I know I hear people say, but we urgently need to address because everything is urgent. Do you believe that when Indigenous people were being removed from their land, they didn't think it was urgent? Or that when people were being brought here, or enslaved, and I can keep going, it's always been urgent. And that is not a reason to skip over the hard work to get to Kumbaya. So what I'm interested in is how can we can be moving, but it's almost like you have to slow down because otherwise there's going to be more trauma, right? That engaging, not saying the right thing. I was thinking about that story in the news in England with the Queen's, one of the ladies in waiting, who had a gathering. It was just, if you've been looking at social media, I'm looking at all of you like you don't know what I'm talking about. Listen.
This is the where are you from? Where are you really from kind of question, yes?
Yes, and invited people who run nonprofits and invited this woman of African descent, a British woman of African descent who runs an organization for women of domestic abuse. And the conversation of the white woman keep asking her, where are you really from? And she's like, I'm a British citizen, but kept pestering her and moving her hair and wanting to read her name. And I was cringing because I was like, I've had all those things happen. It is really rough about that. And I'm willing to believe that the woman doing all of that is not a bad person. 83 years old, there's a lot of things going on. She should be held accountable, but that doesn't make her bad. And I want to know, what's the training going on for all the people working for the Queen? Like, where's the training? Because there should have been some serious in-house training, because everything she did every step was wrong. Not just for the woman who received that, but also for the woman who just got canceled, actually. What does she gain there? Is there any new learning? Did anything change? That's what I want to know. Yeah, I got a lot to say. I'll stop talking now.
Well, we are a little over time, but I promised a final question from our online audience, so we will take that. Garrett.
Sure. So we just wanted to read one of our online guest questions. This question comes from Kristen, who uses she, her pronouns. The question is, Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, believe we are Aina, or land, as do many indigenous people. Can you comment on the effects of the illusion that humans are separate from the land and the effect of the physical and spiritual removal of people from the land?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Kristen. Well, I think I mentioned somewhere earlier in the conversation that I was saying that, that initial Western construction that nature is somehow outside of ourselves, for me, is created one of the first big issues for us, for the rest of us to think about ourselves, because the minute you're outside of something, it is so much easier to do whatever you need to that person, thing, place to get what it is you need, because it's not part of you. So then it makes it a little bit easier to justify certain actions in your head. If you are then part of that thing and you do that, what does that do unto others? If you actually then do that same thing to that land, that person, that tree, that place, you are also doing it to yourself, and therefore it is going to hurt. And I think then you're going to think more about that choice. I think it is a really hard concept, because we have been educated in the American school system for so long to think in a different way, that even when we think about the Hawaiian concept or many indigenous people's concept of that, I think that some of us who are not part of those indigenous communities, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I have a cold, so that's my excuse, that we use that. It's like thinking, I want to change the way that I am, so I'm going to put on a different coat. But as soon as you take the coat off, you're still who you are, as opposed to thinking about how is that then integrated in my life, which means, once again, that you're going to have to change. It's not about simply putting on a different coat. What does it mean to actually consider spirit, dream world, and all of those things equally as we do physical presence and being, and all the other things we count as having value and defining for us what actions we should take and who we are? What does it mean to make space for it? It's not as simply something, that's so lovely. I was just reading this. I'm always doing this. So Avatar, but we don't have time to talk about the movie. But I was reading this whole thing, because I love sci-fi and all that stuff, that how many people, when that movie came out, got depressed because that's the world they wanted. This idea that we could be spiritually attached tangibly to place and be one with that. And I didn't know there were whole groups of people formed around this idea. They became so depressed because when the world isn't like Pandora, right? And what I understood was that need for something so much deeper than what they have been taught or understood and know. And how do we get there? And I'm wondering, maybe we've always been there. And actually, again, it comes back to what we're willing to change in order to make room for those different ways of understanding and connecting and being one with the world. That was too corny. Okay.
But perhaps a good note to close on. I wish we had more time. Yeah. Please join me in thanking Dr. Carolyn Finney for sharing yourself with us and for your thoughts and reflection. And if you want to learn more, carolynfinney.com is one of the ways that we can find you.
Yes, that's one of the ways.
Yes. Thank you for being here. Be well.